It's a great honor to have Ken Holstein visiting us to give a joint seminar between the CS and ICS Informatics departments. Okay, I'll give a very short introduction and I'll get out of your way. Professor Ken Holstein is an assistant professor in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at CMU, where he leads the co-augmentation learning and AI, the Koala Lab. His research focuses on supporting effective forms of AI-augmented work in real-world contexts. Their work draws on approaches from human-computer interactions, artificial intelligence, design, psychology, statistics, and the learning sciences. He has received numerous awards from including ACM Chi. I don't know if these conference names are abbreviated or not, SATML, AIED, ICLS, and have been covered by many outlets, including PBS, Wired, Forbes, the Boston Globe, the Hatchinger Report, and the Marketplace Tech. So it's a great honor to have him here, and I guess we'll let you start. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for the introduction, Sengwoo. So I'm an assistant professor in HCI. And on this slide, I'm quickly sharing some of the other disciplines that have influenced me on the way to HCI. This is a question that I often ask other researchers in HCI or other interdisciplinary spaces because I find it really helpful to understand kind of where they're coming from. As Sengwoo mentioned, at CMU, I lead the Koala Lab. And today I'll share some of our group's work on design for human-AI complementarity. So AI systems are increasingly used to support human work in deeply social contexts, such as classroom teaching, healthcare, and social work. AI-based tools are often introduced into these contexts with the hopes of improving efficiency and helping to overcome limitations of human judgment and decision-making. But at the same time, AI-based judgments are themselves imperfect and biased, even if in different ways than humans, oftentimes. And we see growing recognition of this duality in popular discourse. So for every news headline, you see espousing the promise of using data-driven AI models to improve upon flawed human systems. There's typically another discussing ways that AI risks making things even worse in a given context. A long line of literature suggests that in many domains, humans and AI systems have complementary abilities and limitations. While the gap may narrow over time, many skills we expect will fundamentally defy automation or may be undesirable to automate. So to realize the benefits of AI advances and mitigate their risks, it's critical that we design to elevate what humans actually do best, while also helping them overcome some of their own limitations. A growing body of research at the intersection of HCI, machine learning, and other areas explores how we might design systems that draw upon complementary strengths and mitigate respective limitations of human versus AI decision-making. And the design of human-AI partnerships has been explored across a wide range of real-world domains. But experimental studies evaluating their performance have shown very mixed results. Several studies, such as the examples at the bottom of the slide, show that when humans and AI systems work together, this can improve decision-making compared with either working alone. But many other studies, AI augmentation has failed to improve or has even worsened decision-making. So why do some human-AI pairings succeed while others fail? In our research, we found that there are quite a number of common pitfalls, not limited to the example shown here. So for instance, we often see AI tools fail in practice because their designs are based on faulty assumptions about the nature of human expertise in a given domain. In other cases, we find that there's no reason to believe upfront that the humans involved and the AI system will have complementary strengths. So for example, to make that more concrete, many null or negative results in the literature in our reviews we found have come from studies on Amazon's Mechanical Turk or other crowd work platforms, where crowd workers are asked to assist an AI model on tasks that truly require expert-level domain knowledge. For example, medical or legal expertise, which we can't expect an average crowd worker to have. So in other words, there's only so much that we can draw from these studies in terms of conclusions about human-AI complementarity. To design effective human-AI pairings, we need to engage with real-world contexts where AI is used and understand the capabilities and needs of the humans involved. So in my research group at CMU, several of our projects involve going out into specific workplace contexts that are beginning to experiment with some form of AI augmentation. We study how these technologies are designed, how they're integrated into organizations, and how workers actually use them day to day. And across all of the settings we've studied, a common trend is that the frontline workers who are asked to use these systems day to day tend to see their designs, currently at least, as missed opportunities to truly complement and enhance their abilities. And our analyses of workers' actual processes, their decision-making, typically, unfortunately, back up those perceptions. So today, I'll start by sharing some of our work towards understanding human AI decision-making in real-world settings. And I'll walk you through one of our recent field studies. I'll then discuss how we translate knowledge from these sorts of field studies into theoretical frameworks, attempting to generalize. And then in the last part of the talk, I'll give a broad overview of the ways our group is attempting to support human AI complementarity in practice by exploring alternative approaches to AI interface design, problem formulation among designers and developers, as well as evaluation of human and AI performance. I'm lucky to work with this amazing group of PhD students, and most of the work that you'll hear about today is led by them, as I'll highlight again and again throughout the talk. So in the project that I'll discuss next, we focus on a real-world context, social work, specifically child welfare, where AI-assisted decision-making tools are still relatively under-discussed, but are rapidly spreading. This map from the ACLU in 2021 shows how new algorithmic tools in social work are beginning to spread across the country. The green states are the ones that are currently using or moving towards using a tool. And the yellow states are ones that have previously tried but decided not to use a tool for a variety of reasons. In some cases, for example, community resistance or resistance from frontline workers after a brief deployment. In fact, most of these deployments shown in this map are inspired by a single early tool called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, or AFST for short. And if any of you have read Virginia Eubank's Automating Inequality, you might recognize this tool. This was one of the tools studied in her work. So Allegheny County's Department of Human Services deployed this tool, the AFST, in 2016. The AFST assists social workers in making screening decisions about potential child maltreatment cases, using large amounts of government administrative data, typically that was previously collected before the design of this tool, along with information gathered by call screeners as they take calls with allegations of child maltreatment. The AFST outputs a prediction on a scale from 1 to 20 that's meant to capture future risk of child maltreatment. We see the AFST as particularly critical to study today to inform the future trajectory of AI tools in social services. First, the AFST is one of the longest deployed and most well-known AI-assisted decision-making tools in social services. And beyond Allegheny County, other public sector agencies have looked to the AFST as a model of what AI-assisted decision-making can and should look like. So this includes the various counties shown in the map earlier. On the research side, in the HCI and machine learning communities, the AFST is also among the most studied deployments of AI-based decision support. However, most existing research on the AFST and similar tools have studied the use of these tools from a distance, relying on retrospective quantitative analyses of log data on decisions made, or on online crowd experiments that try to simulate the decision tasks that the workers are performing. But each of which abstract away from the real context in which workers make decisions. And by comparison, we know very little about how workers actually use these kinds of tools in their day-to-day work. So in this project, we conducted an in-depth field study of workers' current practices and challenges in working with the AFST about half a decade into its deployment. And we asked the following research questions. First, how do workers decide whether, when, and how to rely upon algorithmic recommendations in this context. And second, what limitations and future design opportunities do workers perceive for the AFST or for future algorithmic tools? In order to better understand workers' daily experiences working with the AFST, we visited call screeners and their supervisors in their workplace to conduct contextual inquiries and interviews. We shadowed them as they took calls, compiled case reports based on the information in the calls, ran the AFST, and then made screening recommendations or decisions. And as they worked, we would occasionally ask questions to better understand the thought processes behind the actions that we were seeing. And finally, through post-interviews, we would revisit specific moments that we'd observed during the contextual inquiry and would probe deeper into their underlying beliefs and practices underlying the model, using the model. In total, we conducted 2 full-day field visits over the course of 2 weeks, in each case with a researcher observing a separate call screener. And through a series of interpretation sessions and reflexive thematic analyses, we analyzed data from around 38 hours of observations and interviews. So overall, our findings from this study complicate prior narratives in academic literature as well as popular media regarding how tools like the AFST fit into workers' day-to-day decision-making. In the current academic literature, there are 2 prevailing narratives around how frontline decision makers calibrate their reliance on AI-based decision support. They're often viewed as too skeptical of useful AI outputs or too reliant upon erroneous or harmfully biased AI outputs. However, our findings from this study paint a different picture that's not fully captured by either of these 2 narratives. Through a series of interpretation sessions and thematic analyses, we surfaced 4 high-level themes, each capturing a key factor that guides workers' reliance on the AFST model. And in the next slides, I'll briefly describe each of these in turn. First, we observe that workers use their knowledge of rich contextual information surrounding a given case, which is not captured by the administrative data that the model uses. Workers would often actively, intentionally compensate for limitations that they perceived in the model using their own qualitative understanding of case-specific context based on their conversations over multiple phone calls, for instance. For example, unlike the model, workers considered potential cultural misunderstandings, implicit biases, or ulterior motives on the part of the callers. And they use these inferences about intentions, for instance, to inform their decisions about whether to rely on the model or to override a high-risk score on a case-by-case basis. So we conducted a set of quantitative analyses of worker AI decision-making over a 2-year period. And through these analyses, we found that workers, on aggregate, helped to reduce racial disparities in decisions by applying their discretion to override erroneous AFST recommendations. So in the chart on the left here, the left column shows what the rates of screening in cases for investigation would have been for Black versus white children in a hypothetical scenario where workers simply always agreed with the AFST, perfectly followed its recommendations. But as you can see in the right column, when workers applied their discretion, this resulted in a smaller racial disparity and also a lower screen-in rate overall, so leading to a lower number of total investigations. The chart on the right shows the same comparisons, but this time for the measure of accuracy on which the AFST is evaluated. And I'm wording it that way because there are some interesting aspects to the way in which it is evaluated, the proxy measure on which it relies. But as we can see, disparities are again reduced as a result of workers applying their discretion around the model's predictions. And you can also see that this is not uniform for both groups here. I'll highlight quickly, as kind of a shout out to some colleagues, that a second paper conducted independently, which is cited here at the bottom from Fogliato et al., also arrived at the same conclusions, again, through a separate data analysis, which is always nice to see in HCI research, having some quantitative replication. So our qualitative findings shed light onto how these workers were able to reduce these disparities. Our results suggest that workers regularly cross-checked algorithmic outputs with this contextual information that only they had access to in order to identify cases where they thought the AFST's outputs were erroneous or might be harmfully biased. And in aggregate, this had the effect of reducing racial disparities in worker AFST decisions. So to highlight a second major theme in our qualitative analyses, we found that workers form nuanced beliefs about the model's capabilities and limitations relative to their own, in part informed by their cross-checking of contextual information that's unavailable to the model, as I just mentioned. Workers in Allegheny County are intentionally given minimal information about how the AFST model works. And this is to discourage workers from trying to game the model to get desired outputs based on the small set of inputs that they are able to control themselves. However, we found that in the absence of essentially any information about the model, workers improvise strategies to learn about the model on their own through their day-to-day use. So for example, workers often played guessing games with their colleagues, especially during slow periods when not many calls were coming in, where they would gamble on what the risk score might be in a particular case. And in turn, over time, they honed their ability to predict the scores. Through learning strategies like these and others, workers build up their own sophisticated, yet still imperfect, we found, beliefs and intuitions about the model's behavior. So given that these informal beliefs influence their use of the tool, and in the end, also guided their ability to manipulate outputs in some cases, it's unclear whether the agency's goals for limiting model transparency were actually achieved. But this lack of transparency also had other consequences. So for instance, overall, workers tended to be distrustful of the tool, and they also didn't feel equipped to work with it effectively. As a third theme, human reliance is often discussed in the research literature as a matter of trust in AI. But we observed in this study that workers' reliance on the AFST was also quite heavily influenced by their perceptions of organizational pressures and incentive structures around use of the tool, independent, in many cases, of their level of trust in the technology itself. So for example, workers talked about how their organization monitored performance measures assessing how frequently they disagreed with high algorithmic risk scores. And we found that workers would sometimes agree with a high risk score during our observations against their own best judgment, what they believe would be best for a family, best for a child, to avoid being perceived as disagreeing with the AFST too often, which they believed would be frowned upon and may actually jeopardize their job. And they adopted quite sophisticated strategies here, for instance, keeping quotas of how often they're disagreeing so that they could use their budget to apply their discretion in the cases where they believed they could do best by children and families, and not use their judgment in cases where they believe the harm would hopefully be minimized. But of course, there was still harm in their minds. So finally, we found that workers were aware of misalignments between algorithmic predictions and their own decision objectives. And this was quite uniform across workers, regardless of their level of experience, had they been working there for half a year or in some cases for 5 years. So workers described that while they make their decisions based on immediate safety concerns for a child, the model is trained to predict the risk of out-of-home placement in foster care, which is an indirect proxy, over the course of the next 2 years, which is a much larger time span. And interestingly, we found that workers took their knowledge of these conceptual gaps into account when making decisions about when and how to rely upon the tool on a case-by-case basis. However, I'll also mention, workers shared that they weren't actually sure whether or how the organization, those deploying the tool, expected them to account for these, what they saw as quite fundamental gaps. So taken together, our findings paint a more complicated picture than is typically reflected in the literature on AI-assisted decision-making. And overall, even though this tool, the AFST, has been in use for now over half a decade, the system has remained a major source of tension for many workers. As it exists right now, the tool is perceived as a missed opportunity to complement workers' own abilities as human experts. On that note, in a series of co-design activities we ran with social workers, we identified a range of ideas for ways the tool could be redesigned to better support their work. But more importantly than any single interface design, discussing concrete interface design concepts, concrete ideas for new measures like these also helped workers to reflect on more fundamental issues that they had with the tool's overall problem formulation, including actually the very idea of basing decision support on statistical predictions from historical data in a domain like this. And so it was very interesting that for workers who had been using the tool for 5 to 6 years, this co-design session was the first moment of reflection that the very idea of statistical prediction may be somewhat mismatched to their task. Workers felt that the tool's design reflected a poor understanding of the actual nature of their work, the types of decisions they're making, but also the very real challenges that they face day to day, which they might want technologists to help support them with. So they believed that had they been given greater say in the design process earlier on, they would have envisioned fundamentally different kinds of AI-based tools, including, for instance, more support for sense-making rather than direct decision support. So although this case study focused on one specific context, AI-augmented social work, I want to emphasize that many of the challenges we observed here are ones that we've seen again and again and again in other organizations that have experimented with AI-based decision support tools. And in fact, to put these findings into context a bit, when it comes to public sector deployments of AI-based systems, the Allegheny County case is often recognized as an example of an exceptionally thorough deployment. So in other words, this case study reflects the current state of the art in practice. In our paper, we discuss design implications of our findings for multiple audiences, including AI model developers, interface designers, as well as organizational leaders who may be considering deployments in public sector agencies. Before I move on, I'll mention that this work has had a lot of impact at a policy level and in informing public debates about the use of predictive algorithms in social services. So for example, Allegheny County's use of the AFST is now under investigation by the US Department of Justice, as well as the ACLU, particularly around the findings related to racial disparities and some biases against families with disabilities. So for those who might be interested in learning more, I'd recommend checking out this recent ACLU report cited at the bottom here, which builds upon our findings among others and is overall really great work. So building upon findings from field studies, such as the one that I just shared, a major goal in our group is to develop empirically informed theories of human AI complementarity. As research communities accumulate more and more empirical results around human AI decision-making, it's important that we synthesize, organize, and interpret this knowledge into both domain-specific and, where possible, domain-general theories. The development of theory in this area can help in making sense of patterns that emerge across multiple empirical studies. And theory can also serve to proactively guide future research and design efforts towards more promising directions. So as a step towards theory building, we've begun developing frameworks to improve understanding of specific dimensions of human AI complementarity that we see arise in real-world settings. For the sake of time for this talk, I'll preview just one of these frameworks today, which explores an important aspect of the child welfare case study that we just discussed. So predictive models deployed in real-world contexts are often trained to predict labels that imperfectly reflect humans' actual goals. So for example, you've just heard about some of these misalignments in the context of child welfare. As a similar example in a healthcare context, a clinical decision support tool that was deployed widely across US hospitals identified high-risk patients by predicting the dollar cost of their hospital visit. The cost of medical care is an imperfect proxy of people's actual medical need. And as a proxy, it's quite distant also from how human clinicians conceptualize patients' level of need. So this is a really fundamental challenge for these types of tools, because models targeting imperfect labels can introduce damaging downstream impacts, as we talked about in the child maltreatment example. So for instance, in this case of clinical decision support, an investigation found that the use of this tool resulted in 28% fewer Black patients receiving the additional care that they truly needed as compared to similarly sick white patients. Cost of care, as it turned out, was a systematically worse proxy for Black patients' medical need, given the way that this population tends to access medical care. So extreme examples like this one underscore that if a predictive model is targeting the wrong outcome, it's unlikely to help a human make the right decision. But practically speaking, at the same time, even in the best case, we might expect some amount of conceptual misalignment between model and human objectives. And the implications of this for research on AI-assisted decision-making have been relatively underexplored. So while a growing body of work has focused on topics such as explainability and trust and reliance in AI, the vast majority of this work focuses on improving predictive performance with respect to the label targeted by a model. In effect, adopting this label as the ground truth for both the model as well as the human. So in this work, we developed a framework to help researchers from the HCI and machine learning communities to first better understand the implications of imperfect proxy labels for AI-assisted decision-making, and second, to help identify gaps in our current empirical understanding that can then be explored in future research studies. We developed our framework through a review of a wide range of real-world AI deployments. We synthesized possible causal models to characterize AI-assisted decision-making across different real-world settings. And we then stress-tested these by attempting to identify counterexamples in collaboration with relevant domain experts for each of our case studies. Through this process, we sketched out a space of causal diagrams to shed light on different causal configurations and corresponding statistical biases that can arise in real-world AI-assisted decision-making settings in light of potential information asymmetries, humans and models having access to different information, as well as misaligned predictive targets between humans and models, and intervention effects, where historical decisions upon which a model might be trained actually also have potential to influence the outcome that's being predicted. Although I won't dive into all of the details of this framework in this talk, I do want to share what the framework allowed us to see, some of the implications, with respect to existing HCI research literature on AI-assisted decision-making. So building upon a recent systematic literature review, we used our framework to re-examine experimental human subject studies that have been published at HCI and machine learning venues over the last half-decade. And we found that a majority of these, around 92% of published experimental studies, examined a narrow subregion of our causal framework. In doing so, interestingly, most published studies actually constructed artificial environments that favored the model, the AI model, over humans. For instance, by eliminating the possibility that humans could have access to complementary information about the world in an online simulation study, the potential for humans to bring complementary knowledge to the table was greatly reduced in many of these studies compared to the corresponding deployment settings. So a takeaway is that this suggests that there's a lot of opportunity for future research to rigorously study human AI decision-making under conditions that more closely reflect the complexities of real-world deployment settings. And our hope is that this framework can serve as a useful guide in brainstorming ideas for new experiments conducted on crowd platforms, for instance. So if you're interested in learning more about this framework, please check out the paper, which will be presented by Luc Gordon, a PhD student working with us at the FACT conference this year. All right, so far today, I've talked about some of our efforts towards better understanding human AI decision-making. In the last part of today's talk, I'll give you a quick overview of some of the ways that we're working to address several of the challenges that I've mentioned. So first, in one strand of our research, we're exploring the impacts of new kinds of interfaces for worker training and reflection. As an example of a specific direction under this theme, in many real-world settings we study, including the ones I've discussed today, frontline workers have access to a lot of decision-relevant information that AI systems cannot access. However, we found that in practice, frontline workers, such as teachers in K-12 education settings, will sometimes attribute knowledge to AI systems that these systems don't actually have about their students, and in fact cannot possibly have. And these sorts of misunderstandings bring dangers, such as the risk of over-reliance on AI recommendations or over-trust. So we've been exploring the effects of interfaces that explicitly try to help people learn about and reflect upon model unobservables, a term often used to describe the information that humans may have access to, but which an AI model does not. And one way we've studied this experimentally is through a series of studies in the context of AI-assisted house price prediction, similar to use of the Zestimate feature on Zillow. So far through these studies, we've found that helping people to better understand how their own perceptual abilities complement those of an AI model, so in some sense an explanation of what the human can see rather than just an explanation of what the model knows, can actually enable them to better calibrate their reliance on AI when it's time to make decisions. In a related project under this theme, we've been studying the effects of interactive training tools, like intelligent tutoring systems, that give workers low-stakes opportunities to practice making AI-assisted decisions while receiving immediate feedback on their decision-making. In real-world deployment settings, we found that AI tools are often introduced with little or no training to help workers learn to use them effectively. So to try to study this and get a better understanding of ways in which workers might be supported in onboarding, we ran an online experimental study with both social work students who are training to work in child welfare in this case, and crowd workers, which simulated the context of the Allegheny family screening tool that I discussed earlier. And through this study, we found that by giving novices an accelerated series of low-stakes opportunities to practice AI-assisted decision-making, they learned to disagree with AI predictions more often over a relatively short period of time. And in turn, their patterns of disagreement actually fairly quickly came to resemble that of actual workers in the field with many months of experience. Now, I should say their performance overall, given that they're novices, did not come to reflect those of workers with many years of experience. The patterns of disagreeing with AI did. So finally, in a third project, we're exploring the design of training interactions for co-creative contexts, such as AI-augmented illustration and manufacturing design. And so in each of these contexts, we're exploring ways to support designers in learning to work more co-creatively and in developing more accurate mental models of co-creative systems, capabilities, and limitations in relation to their own abilities as professional designers. In a more recent strand of our research, we've been studying ways to improve how AI development teams formulate problems in the first place. So turning much of our attention in this strand to developers and designers themselves. So for example, we're currently working with AI development teams in both private sector contexts as well as various public sector agencies like Allegheny County to empirically study how they go about brainstorming ideas for new human AI systems to build in the first place at the earliest stages of a given project. Organizations, for instance, in the public sector, are generally motivated to invest in systems that bring real benefits to various stakeholders and that avoid getting them bad press on the front page of the New York Times. So we're experimenting with the development of new processes for use at very early stages that can help teams ideally innovate in directions that are more likely to produce the real value that they're after and that carry fewer risks of harm. And finally, in a third strand of our research, we're focusing on improving how AI systems are evaluated in practice. So building upon frameworks like the one I shared earlier, we're currently exploring the development of new quantitative evaluation methods. And our goal in this work is to develop methods that can provide fairer assessments of human versus AI performance without artificially stacking the cards in favor of the AI system, by trying to bring out more human strengths that current evaluation methods often overlook or mask. And finally, in a related set of projects related to evaluation, we're developing new methods and tools that can empower non-AI experts to engage in critically evaluating AI-based tools that impact their lives. So to make this concrete, in a recent project, we developed a comic strip-based method that helps non-AI experts understand and weigh in on otherwise opaque AI system design choices. For example, specific operationalizations of high-level concepts. And so we use this method with unhoused people and homeless services workers to invite them to scrutinize a real AI system that had been deployed by local government to make decisions about who to prioritize for housing in their city, and in turn, who to deprioritize. So overall, we found that when properly empowered to do so, our participants were able to provide highly specific critical feedback on the AI system's design. For example, in their own words, participants raised concerns related to the system's overall objective, choices of outcome proxy variables to help operationalize that objective, and also issues such as the system's robustness to data set shift, among several others. We took these findings back to the county deploying the system, and many of the issues raised by community members actually had not been anticipated, inspiring them to look into them. For instance, potential threats to stability over its deployment. In a related set of projects, we're exploring the design of new tools and mechanisms that can support end user feedback on AI systems behavior in deployment. So our goal is to empower end users, whether frontline workers or users of online platforms, to identify harmful algorithmic behaviors and biases based on their day-to-day experiences interacting with AI systems, and also to help them, in turn, push for meaningful improvements. Ultimately, in this line of work, we're interested in fostering a bidirectional learning loop between situated end users on one side and AI developers on the other. All right, so before I wrap up and open for questions, I'd like to again thank my amazing students and collaborators, as well as our study participants, research partners, and funders. And I'll leave you with this set of critical questions for both researchers and practitioners, designers working in this space, which is based on the set of research that I've presented today. If any of these questions or really any of the research directions that I shared today resonate with you, I'd love to chat more and explore opportunities to collaborate. Thank you.
So this is great work, Ken. Thank you so much. And it seems very important as well. Like, I'm glad you were doing this. And so the strategies of sort of resistance amongst frontline workers are really kind of intriguing here, and sort of like, point us in all sorts of useful directions. I'm wondering if you've had any kind of opportunity to also talk to sort of institutional leaders, because I'm kind of intrigued by how they are also under pressures to adopt AI systems. And so you're talking, it was your comment about sort of not wanting to be on the front page of the New York Times, because one way to be on the front page of the New York Times is to have a system that is inherently biased and obviously biased, but the other one is not to have adopted AI when it's around and available. So I'm just kind of interested in what sort of strategies of resistance there might be available for them, and if you've had any opportunity to find out anything about that.
Absolutely. So this is a good moment to, actually the slide where I was mentioning ending up on the front page of the New York Times, that's some studying up work that we're doing currently that's focusing on organizational leaders as well as one level above them, some of the representatives that are applying the pressure on these organizational leaders and AI developers. We're essentially studying both the process of ideation, which I mentioned, but also studying this network of pressures and incentives, working with them to co-develop strategies for resistance. At this point, so I'll advertise this work is led by amazing PhD student Anna Kawakami, and hopefully the work should be out soon. But we're essentially kind of working on two thrusts. One of them focuses somewhat narrowly on developing new deliberation processes, protocols to support what we're seeing happening in various rooms within these organizations, supporting ideation and helping them within the constraints that they're working under to try to ideate directions that are still responsive to the pressures they're under without changing them. But we see a lot of opportunity, a lot of wiggle room actually, even within that, to produce less harmful, more valuable systems. So there are issues with the design process there. But a second thrust is a little bit more focused on supporting leaders in resistance. So not just ideating within those constraints, but working to advocate and try to change some of those constraints and push against those pressures.
Thanks. Wonderful talk, Ken. Can you say a little bit more about what happens when a screener makes a decision? A social worker might get sent out. What is the consequence of the decision? How does that information come back, and do they use that to evaluate their own accuracy, the AI's accuracy? How is that updated?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the AI system is trained on this distal outcome, which one real-world outcome, which could, in theory, be used as feedback for human workers. This is actually something that we explored, and we found that human workers were extremely resistant to the idea that this was a meaningful outcome. And that maps onto some of the findings I discussed about them kind of fundamentally disagreeing with the proxy that's used. So the proxy, one of those proxies is whether a child is placed into foster care within the next 2 years. And so there are some disconnects there, including the timeline. Generally, human workers are interested in feedback signals over smaller periods of time, and ideally, although of course there are practical constraints here, that would not rely upon a proxy, but would get closer to what they're actually after, threats to safety. But that data usually is not available, or when it is available, it's quite sparse. To get to the first part of your question, though, you were asking about kind of the decision process, the pipeline. If a call screener and a supervisor, aided by the AFST model, decide to screen in a case, the family will be investigated by a caseworker who will actually go out into the field. If that happens, one of the risks, like there are risks on both sides, and this is one of the disconnects actually, that humans are making these multifaceted decisions. Some of this has been discussed in the economics literature, for example, as admitted payoffs problems, but they're actually making decisions where there are many factors beyond just making a prediction of an outcome. They're thinking about, for example, risk to Black families of a decision to send out a caseworker, somewhat separable from the prediction of whether a child may be at risk for some form of maltreatment in itself. There is significant literature suggesting, and those working in child welfare tend to be quite aware of this, that there is much higher risk if a Black family, for instance, also poorer families, receive an investigation, that their child will be wrongfully removed from the family, meaning that there is no actual child maltreatment. Now, of course, on the other side, you want to be cautious about endangering a child's life. And so those are the kind of risks on both sides that these workers are trying to navigate.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question about the user and community-based approach that you are currently experimenting. And my question is, I wonder whether the extent to which the AI model comes with a set objectives and design choices could affect how the conversation or the type of feedback from communities come out. Like whether when you have like already very established AI model and ask them some feedback, or like you have like very open-ended questions about the model, like you're in the very like beginning phase of the design, I guess like the feedback interaction can be really different. So have you ever explored that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. So I guess personally, I would say almost at an emotional level, my favorite projects are the ones in which we get in early before a system is developed, because it tends to be the case, especially if we're working with some project, public schools, hospitals, public sector agencies. After a model has been fully developed, and in some cases millions of dollars have been poured into it, as you might expect, there's much greater resistance to change and very strong resistance generally to saying, whoops, this was the wrong system entirely, let's scrap it and build a new one. So we've used some of these methods, for example, the comic-based method that I presented at an early stage, and in other work we've also used it at later stages. In later stages, we tend to, in terms of impact, directly, what developers will actually be willing to do, it's tended to be the case that they will selectively take from our findings the most incremental steps that they can take, which is unfortunate, but it's been kind of our reality. So for instance, issues with problem formulation, or cases where community members surface some alternative proxy variable that they believe, they hypothesize, would carry much fewer of the risks as the current proxy variable used. If that requires some new data collection, extra work, it's likely that that will be greatly deprioritized on the list. One of the directions in the example I brought up with the housing prioritization system that was actually taken up by the county was trying to better address distribution shift. And that, from what we could tell, was simply because they felt that that could be done at relatively low cost with relatively low effort. But yes, that's an extremely important dimension. Yeah. I guess a follow-on to that is we're also very interested in, some of our projects right now are working on methods that even after a system is deployed can try to engage community members or end users in contributing to more fundamental changes. In other words, lowering some of those costs, even if there would otherwise be resistance from an organization. That, of course, is still tricky. It requires some baseline level of buy-in from the organization. But this is part of what I meant when I briefly mentioned feedback mechanisms, where, for example, frontline workers using a tool on a day-to-day basis might be able to provide feedback to better align a tool that has is currently fundamentally predicting something different than what they actually care about, which again is a very common situation across, it's been true across every real-world setting that we've worked in, that we have some proxy with undesirable characteristics.
I guess that's, if there's no more questions, I guess we can thank the speaker again.